Hi, this is Andy. Can you think of situations in the course of your life when you felt almost stuck? I mean, I talked with some people just this week. In fact, one person in particular just feels stuck in their career. Talked with some of my MBA students who feel stuck. I mean, unsure of what course to pursue in their career. I've got dear friends who are walking through some difficult medical issues and feel stuck, unsure about what to do next. Whether it's major situations like those or the smaller situations that confront us as part of life, feeling stuck is a common experience for us. And today, I'm excited to introduce you to one of my favorite new books. Adam Alter joined us back in episode 177 to talk about his book, Irresistible. And if you haven't listened to that, I highly recommend you go back and check it out. The challenges and the ideas are just as relevant today as they were 5 years ago. But today, Adam returns to talk about his new book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough: How to Get Unstuck When It Matters Most. Now, if you're familiar with Adam's work, you'll know it's evidence based and beautifully written, which makes it a joy to read. But this book is packed with practical ideas that can help you with your current challenges, as well as those that you'll inevitably be encountering in the years ahead. I strongly recommend this book and can't wait to introduce some of the ideas in today's discussion. But first, here's a quick question. Have you noticed the constant stream of news about emerging AI tools and capabilities? It's not always clear how these technologies can actually benefit us as leaders of teams and projects. That's why my team and I have developed a new e learning offering, AI Made Simple, a practical guide to using AI in your everyday work. This self guided course is designed specifically for leaders like you, interested in harnessing the power of AI to enhance your work. If you're looking to stay ahead of the curve in the fast changing world of business, streamline your workflow, boost your productivity, AI Made Simple is a great next step. Check the show notes for more information and join us to unlock the potential of AI for your team and projects. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Adam about his new book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough. Adam, thank you for joining us again on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy.
Hey, to understand what you mean by getting stuck, would you be up for sharing some examples from your life of like when you were stuck, and do you use those to explain what you mean by the term?
Yeah, so I think of getting stuck or being stuck as something that's not momentary. It's not like a moment of frustration. It's usually something that afflicts you for weeks, months, sometimes years, and sometimes even decades of your life. And I'm not so interested in periods when we're stuck because, say, in April 2020, there was a pandemic and you couldn't travel. We were stuck physically in space. That's not that interesting to me. What's more interesting is the many instances of stuckness where we have some power to change things. So in my life, I've had many such instances. One of them was early on in my undergrad career where I wasn't sure what I wanted to study. And in Australia, you applied not just to a university, but to a particular degree. So I applied to an actuarial science program and I was on a fellowship, and it was great. I was very lucky to be on that fellowship. It funded my studies. But about 6 months in, it was very clear to me that that wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I was at the point where I either had to continue or I would have to pay back the money that I'd been given over those 6 months. And so it was clear to me that I wanted to stop right then and there before that clause kicked in. But then I was stuck. I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing with my life, my career, my profession. And so I spent 6 months basically sitting in on every lecture I could find: English, organic chemistry, math, languages, philosophy, law, medicine. I looked for everything and anything and wanted to graze the territory, the intellectual landscape, to get a sense of what I found interesting and worth pursuing. And at the end of that 6 months, it was clear to me that there were two paths that I found appealing. One was the law, and the other one was psychology, and that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you didn't end up as
Yeah,
an actuary.
it's worked out.
Yeah, it's worked out really well. Yeah, I'd say one of my most extended periods of feeling stuck was in my late 20s, early 30s, when I battled anxiety like never before. And what I didn't know then, Adam, was that the experience I was going through was more common than I realized. I mean, many people, perhaps an increasing number of people over the years, have similar struggles. Yet I thought it was a uniquely Andy struggle. And one of the clear messages of your book is that it's not a matter of if we're going to get stuck, it's when. And I'd love for you to tell us about Bruce. Is it pronounced Feiler? Bruce Feiler. It's
Yeah.
yeah, and some of his insights that you learned from talking with him about the inevitability of setbacks.
Yeah, so he's a phenomenal human being, a brilliant guy, very soulful, very intellectual. This brilliant blend of science and art. There are some people who are out there, just Renaissance individuals who they just have a great way of bringing together evidence and stories and anecdote, and he's great at that. And so I chatted to him, and one of the things he'd been doing for the past few years was speaking to people about their lives, and in particular when they experience periods of change, to get a sense just in an anthropological way of how common change tends to be. Do people experience a lot of it? Do they not experience it all that often? And what he found was that they experienced these small bits of change constantly. There's nothing surprising about that. But they also experienced what he called life quakes several times or more in their lives, maybe between 5 and 10 times roughly. And these life quakes are really world changing for individuals, but they are universal. We all go through them. They could be things like a forced change in career. They could be the death of a loved one, a divorce, a separation, the birth of a child. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. And he basically talked about how blindsided we tend to be by these periods of change. And so I thought that dovetailed really nicely with some of the ideas that I'd come across in some studies that I'd been doing. I've been asking thousands of people around the world about their experiences with change and stuckness. And you just said that it feels isolating and lonely to be stuck. Well, what I found was exactly that although it's universal, people always feel alone and isolated by it. It's sort of taboo. It's not the sort of thing that people talk about willingly. We always see the polished after effect. People only share the best and the most polished versions of themselves. And so I thought it was important to talk about the fact that we do get stuck and also that there's a way through.
Yeah. I feel like it's an empowering, actually really encouraging book in that regard, you know? And clearly, I think it's obvious that many examples of getting stuck are unchosen, right? They just seem to happen to us. But there are some patterns that I was intrigued with out of your book, that if we can recognize them ahead of time, we might be able to mitigate their impact. And one of the traps that caught my attention, Adam, might be summarized of, even if it's a problem, it's tiny. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the work of Matthew Frey, including his comment, the things that destroy love and marriage often disguise themselves as unimportant, if I got that right. Now, it could be that, listeners are feeling stuck in their love or marriage relationship, but all of us could get there someday, right? So why is Frey's insight so important? And can you think of any ways you and your wife, Sarah, proactively seek to avoid getting stuck?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think Frey talks about is that we mistake a lot of small problems or small issues, little moments of friction, for minor until they become major problems. So the theme of that area of the book is we often think things are not worth our time and attention until they become really big problems. But especially in relationships, in marriage, in other relationships, and in particular in romantic relationships, these small bits of friction that are unaddressed, they're like paper cuts, and over time they become pretty substantial. And Frey talks about these silly conversations he had with his then ex-wife, where he talks about the fact that, she would ask something very simple, like, please don't leave a cup by the dishwasher or by the sink, please put it away. And he would push back on that. He'd feel aggrieved and he'd be frustrated, and he'd recognize that, yeah, he probably could have done things differently, but he felt sort of frustrated that she kept asking, and he wouldn't really read between the lines to recognize that really this wasn't a conversation about a cup next to the sink. It was a conversation about connecting, being heard, about saying to a person, I know that's important to you. Maybe it's not that important to me. The home doesn't rest on where the cups are for me. There are other things that matter, but I know that for you, that's important. And so just because I respect you and love you, I'm going to take that seriously. And he talks about how if he had done that, not just in that instance, but in many others, he thinks that would have been enough to salvage a relationship that once it ended, he realized was very valuable, and he missed it.
Yeah. I think of a friend who once told me for his marriage, he said, a date once a week, of a weekend away every quarter, and once a year, something else. It reminded me of your ABC check system that you had in the book. If you wouldn't mind explaining that. And I don't know, do you and Sarah do anything? Just be curious.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I think that's really that's a really good link between how to manage a relationship over time, especially when you're busy, especially perhaps if you have young children,
Yeah.
and you have tons of demands. There are work demands and other demands. So that ABC check system that you're describing, this is how airline mechanics make sure that aircraft are safe. And so the big tussle with aircraft is that they run almost all the time. They're very rarely idle, because every minute that an aircraft is idle is a lot of lost money for the airline. So you don't want to bring them out of the sky and put them in the hangar and check them for too long if you don't have to. But also, it's obviously catastrophic when something goes wrong. So you're balancing these two constraints and requirements. So what do you do? Well, what you do is you have a series of different checks that are run at different points in time. The A checks happen constantly, where you're constantly monitoring and making sure that some small things are working as they should. Technicians come, or engineers come onto the plane at the end of every flight, before every flight, make sure that some of these minor issues are working. Some of them are very important, but they can be checked quickly. Then the B check is a slightly more intensive check, and that happens a little bit less often. And that's to check some more major things that require a little bit more downtime, perhaps a few hours of downtime. Then there are C and D checks that are much more comprehensive. C checks happen perhaps every year, and D checks perhaps every several years. And that requires taking the plane out of service for a period of months, almost unbuilding it and rebuilding it to make sure everything's working. Now, if you did that all the time, the plane would never run, but it has to be done at least sometimes. And so you have these different levels of checking in and testing that in some are supposed to mean that you're balancing the requirement that this thing keeps operating and you get use from it, but it's also safe. Now, that's true for a relationship too. So that idea that the A checks are the date nights once a week, the B checks are the quarterly weekends away, the C and the D checks are celebrating big anniversaries, going away for a week, maybe just the two of you once a year. And that's exactly what we do. Actually, we're having our 10-year wedding anniversary this year, and we're going away to Europe for a week. We're recruiting the grandparents to help out.
That's great.
Yeah, and so that's exactly right. I mean, that for us is essentially a D check. We haven't taken a vacation like that in a very long time, and so I think those are very important to schedule in.
Sometimes you hear people say, and we're talking about marriage a lot, but it could be other kind of things they seem to just fall off a cliff, but we don't fall off a cliff. It's one step at a time, right? And careers, you don't usually lose a job just one day at a time, although that can be the case. It's often just little, like one day at a time things, right? Not just this moment. Trying to get ahead of it is really part of what that chapter is about, I think, right?
Yeah, that's the human trap, is that until something is of a certain magnitude, it doesn't really register for us. I love the idea of the Y2K bug, which I talk about a little bit. This idea that in the 1960s, an IBM engineer noticed that when we ticked over to the year 2000s, the last two digits of the date for the year variable would say 00, and computers would confuse 2000 for the year 1900. And that he thought that would cause all sorts of problems. Maybe planes would fall from the sky, power plants would explode. He had all these theories. And he talked to governments about it, and they all said, well, it's not that big a deal yet. It's far off in the future. Someone else will figure it out. And then the 90s arrived, and governments ended up spending billions on this problem. They didn't understand it properly, but they'd had 30-something years to grapple with it, and they hadn't done the job. So I think there is a lot of value in tackling problems as soon as they arise, when they're still small enough to be dealt with easily.
Yeah. I think it's a brilliant idea. Let's say someone listening to us, they've encountered a sticking point of some sort. In fact, let's say they recently lost their job, which it's a very real life quake for many people right now. In fact, and one of the strategies you talk about is reframing something as a challenge rather than as a threat. And in fact, I'd love if you could describe the idea of radical acceptance and how it might apply to the person who's feeling stuck because of a job loss.
Yeah, so one of the big ideas in the book is that the first response you have to being stuck is usually counterproductive. So if I'm physically trapped, say an object is pinning me down, everything in my evolutionary past is working in my favor. I get a rush of adrenaline. Some people develop what is known as hysterical strength. People pick up cars to free themselves or other people. It's an incredible thing. So that's very adaptive. But that same response, we kind of mistake being intellectually or emotionally stuck for the same situation, and we flail. And that kind of adrenaline is very unhelpful in those situations. So the best thing you can do is to slow down, dial down the temperature. And radical acceptance is this, it's based and grounded in Eastern and Buddhist philosophy. The idea basically that some things just suck. They are bad. They are not nice. They're not the way you'd like the world to be. But the first thing you need to be able to do is to accept them as they are before you can work on moving past them. And that is important for a number of reasons. It slows you down. It tamps down your anxiety, which we all feel when we're stuck. It's a very natural human and animal response. And once you've done that, once you've accepted this is where I am, I'm going to take what one of the practitioners of this approach, Tara Brach, calls the sacred pause. Once you take that pause, you're much better positioned to strategically deal with the problem rather than flailing. And there are some amazing examples of this. I talk about Lionel Messi, the soccer player, I think the greatest soccer player in the world today and possibly of all time. He does exactly this, but in the context of a game. So when the whistle blows, everyone else starts running around the pitch. Messi just ambles around for a few minutes, just calming his nerves, getting a sense of what everyone's doing, looking at whether there are any players who are perhaps injured, or is there a weakness on the opposition that he didn't anticipate. And those few minutes that he sacrifices at the beginning of the game when he's walking around slowly make him much more effective for the remaining 95% of the game.
Yeah. That idea of the pause, I needed to hear that because I want to jump to action right away. And you actually get to the point about the importance of action eventually. But
Yes.
this wisdom in pausing, and something that I hope to not forget, because I had the opportunity to implement a couple times since reading your book, is the acronym RAIN, RAIN. And so if you wouldn't mind explaining what that is and maybe how it could help maybe someone, how it helped you or someone else. How did it help them through the situation?
Yeah, so the RAIN acronym, it's described first by Judson Brewer, who is a psychologist who is actually a medical doctor as well. And he is very, very interested in his research in how you can overcome the craving to do something like smoke. So if you're trying to quit cigarettes, but he himself has never smoked. And he wrote this great book, The Craving Mind, about this idea that we need to figure out how we can help people, especially in his case, people who are doing something that he himself did not do. And so as a therapist and as a researcher, he needed to approximate what it would be like to feel that sense of craving. And so he trained himself to meditate by sitting for 2 hours doing absolutely nothing, just sitting in place and not letting his mind wander, which is an unbelievably difficult thing to do. But he managed to do it. It took him, his book is terrific, The Craving Mind, because he goes into a lot of depth about how he learned how to do this, how important it was for his welfare, for his well-being. And RAIN is the acronym that he uses to describe the process of dealing with the difficulty or the pain of trying to do something that your body is sort of fighting against you to do. And he talks about the whole process of accepting it and letting it wash over you almost like a wave and grappling with it. And then ultimately you come through it. And he actually managed, he talks about the day when he managed to get past that barrier, and he spent 2 hours meditating.
I can imagine. If I remember, the specifics of the acronym were recognize, is either allow or acknowledge, but I think it's allow it to be
it's
there.
Allow, yeah.
Investigate and then note what's going on. But we got back from overseas and I still wasn't feeling 100%. And instead of like, oh, I got to get better, it's like, hey, just allow it. I think actually the allowing might be the most difficult and the most critical. I wonder.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the allow is kind of like the radical acceptance component of all of this process. It sucks and that's okay. And I will inhabit the space that I'm in right now, despite the fact that it's not where I want to be. And then I'll figure out what I'm going to do next. But right now I'm going to allow it to suck and I'm just going to deal with it.
Yeah. I think that it's a powerful, it's actually so simple in some ways, but
it is
not easy, I suppose. Yeah. I was talking with some friends just recently about the idea of hardship inoculation. I'd never heard that until I read your book. So how do you like to explain that and how does it apply to getting stuck?
Yeah, this is an idea that comes from some of my own research. So one of the things I was very curious about was I'd read a lot of stories of athletes and how they trained, and I'd worked with the Australian Institute of Sport and a number of other organizations that trained athletes. And, there are two prevailing theories. One is that you never want to train too hard, which makes sense. You want to sort of build up confidence, slowly get up to the point where you're stronger and stronger and stronger. And the other is an approach used by a lot of elite athletes, which is you basically hit yourself in the face with a really, really complex challenge that might even exceed what you would face in the act of actually competing. So you'll find golfers, for example, talk about the fact that you can win or lose an entire round of golf based on a single shot. And so you need to maintain the same level of concentration for 70 something shots of the game. So how do you do that? How do you ensure that you do that when it's a tournament? You've got four days of golf in a row. You've got 72 holes, 18 holes times 4. So 72 holes. One way you do that is when you're practicing, you don't just play 18 holes in a day, you play 3 rounds in a day, play 54 holes. And that's an incredibly big challenge. But if you can concentrate for 54 holes, then it becomes much easier to concentrate for 18 in competition. So hardship inoculation is the idea that if you expose yourself to some hardship today, when it really matters, you will have been inoculated against hardship and you'll be much better prepared. And I found in some of my research that basketball players on college basketball teams, their pre-seasons are to some extent randomized. Sometimes they play very strong teams, sometimes weaker teams. And I found that the teams that played relatively stronger teams, all else being controlled roughly, tended to do much better during the competitive part of the season than the teams that played against easier teams. So there's a lot of value in that struggle that you get during these earlier phases.
Yeah, I found myself, and this is kind of silly mind game, but if I went through something difficult, I haven't gone through a terrible time since I've read your book, but I'm like, this is just inoculating me for the future. You know, I think there's something kind of powerful about that. I'm like, yeah, all right, this, like you said, this sucks, but this is part of life. Allow it. But then it's like, also, you know, this is preparing me for the future too. I mean, is there wisdom in that, I suppose?
100%. I think everything that's hard. There was this great clip recently. Giannis Antetokounmpo, the phenomenal basketball player for the Milwaukee Bucks, was asked a question by someone in the media. You know, you didn't win this season. You didn't win the championship. So, you know, what is it like to fail again? And he really bristled at that question. He did not like the question. He said, you know, you asked me that last year as well, and I didn't appreciate it then, and I appreciate it even less now. And the best part of his response, I think, and there was a lot that he said that was really philosophically intelligent, but the best part was he said, Michael Jordan played for 15 years and won 6 championships. Would you like to claim that the other 9 years were failures? Or do you see his career as the holistic sum of 15 years, a triumphant career? And the fact that he didn't win every one of those 15 years doesn't make it less triumphant. It's still a huge triumph. And those 9 years were in the service of something that had to happen to make the other 6 years. It's all part of the soup of what is being created. And I thought that was really smart because, as you say, those moments that are hard where you're kind of gutting through something, they're not for nothing. They are for many things. Sometimes you're learning something new, specific skills. Sometimes you're just learning what it's like to endure difficulty, which is really valuable and which will come in very handy later on, because there are a lot of things in life that are hard.
Yeah, that's true. I want to go back and look at that interview. That's
it's great.
Yeah, it sounds like, yeah. You know, one of the ways you've been helping organizations in recent years is, you know, to simplify the complex is by doing a friction audit. And I'd love if you could just give us an overview, like, what is that? What do you mean by that term? And how could it apply to someone who's feeling stuck, let's say with their career?
Yeah, so this begins in some consulting work that I've done for big businesses, but also for nonprofits, for charities. And every business basically says, how do we spend the least money to make the biggest impact in our bottom line or our ability to raise money or whatever it is? And this is the technique that for me has been most effective. And a friction audit is basically where you go into an organization and you say, the best thing you can do is to find areas either within your organization or in your dealings with consumers where there's some friction that's causing problems, slowing things down, gumming up the works, making it impossible to close sales, whatever it might be. It's often just kind of red tape or the structures you have in place or the forms you ask people to fill out or the hard decisions you ask them to make, whatever it might be. And by sanding those down, you basically find them, you fix them, and then you look at whether that's had a positive effect. That tends to be a really great way to improve the way an organization operates. And usually it's about simplifying. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example. I was working with some shopping malls in Australia. And one of the big questions they had was, we find that a lot of people will come and shop at the mall, but then they'll abandon their carts without buying what they've clearly spent a lot of time putting in the carts, which makes no sense. And we figured out that essentially there are people who shop with their kids. The kid has a tantrum and they have to leave immediately. So what do you do? Well, one thing you can do is you can spend a couple of $1,000s putting in a jungle gym somewhere in the shopping mall. publicize it, make sure that the parents know about it. And then the kids, when they have those tantrums, either before they get to that point or to help them work through it, you take them to the jungle gym and they play for a bit, and then you can finish the shopping trip. That is a really inexpensive intervention. For a huge shopping mall to put in a couple of $1,000s worth of jungle gym equipment, they reap hundreds of thousands of dollars or more in rewards as a result of that. And therefore, it's an incredibly effective friction reduction intervention. And that's the kind of thing that a friction audit does. But you can use it in your own life too. Figure out where the friction is, sand it down, and make sure that you've done a good job.
Are irritations forms of friction? I mean, in your terminology, is that example of one?
They can be, yeah, especially if the irritation has follow-on consequences that are negative, or if it really grates on you over time. Yeah. If there's a way for you to just weed it out, just pull it out at the roots and throw it aside, then that's a brilliant use of your time.
Yeah. I was trying to think of other career-related ones that might come to mind to you of frictions. I'm being passed over for a promotion, maybe. It would be one of those like, now, why? That's happened a couple of times. Why has that been? What can I do?
Yeah.
Instead, would that potentially be something?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think part of it is also asking yourself, like, what is my least favorite part of my job? And is there any way for me to make it less least favorite? Maybe it's still not going to be my favorite, but I want it to be slightly more appealing. Yeah. And you will find if you take the 3 things you like least about what you do, and you either somehow work out a way to outsource them or remove them from your list, your docket of tasks, or you somehow improve them or pair them with a reward that makes them much more appealing. When I finish this, I will do X, whatever X is for you. You'll change your life. I mean, I have this thing for me. It's about travel, that I travel quite a lot. And I find the business of getting to the airport, being at the airport, flying often very long distances, dealing with jet lag, it's on balance the most friction-filled part of my existence. And I'm not the only one. I think everyone on some level who travels a lot feels that. Yeah. So I spend a huge amount of time and effort removing the friction points associated with travel. And I will spend more money than is probably rational because that will make the whole trip, changes the complexion of all of it. And the part of the problem with that travel issue is that it's the beginning and the end of the trip. And we know that the first and last parts of an experience end up coloring that experience in a dramatic way. So I try to make the trip as pleasurable as possible, including that travel portion that I really generally don't enjoy.
Yeah, I love it. That's really good. During the intro, I mentioned a reference to artificial intelligence, and it's just kind of crazy how the last months have been, right? And so I don't think it got much mention in the book, or at least I don't remember it. But any thoughts about how you could see using AI to help us getting unstuck, or how it applies to this? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I wrote the book before the rise of the wave of generative AI that we're dealing with now. And yes, there is. And there's actually something that I've been doing for a while that I found very useful. I talk in the book about crowdsourcing and diversity and the importance of getting diverse opinions. There's this great study that shows that we tend to approach people who are a lot like us for advice, and that magnifies our strengths, but also magnifies our weaknesses. And it's kind of redundant. You don't need to ask someone who's basically your carbon copy for advice. They'll tell you what you already know. So what you're looking for essentially is non-redundancy. Non-redundancy is non-overlapping backgrounds, interests, attitudes, values to help you make a decision with a new, fresh perspective. And that's what companies often do. Like I remember when I was a grad student, I remember seeing recruiters come to the university. They'd say, who's the smartest psychology student? Who's the smartest Russian literature student? Who's the smartest mathematician? Who's the smartest organic chemistry student? We want all of them. I know they're all different. They don't have expertise in what we do, but we want to bring them in because they can learn. And we're looking for diversity of opinion and background. So ChatGPT or other generative AI models, they all are diverse agents, and often agents of chaos. Because they're unpredictable, and sometimes they say things that are outlandish, and the feedback they give you is nonsense, but it jostles you, and it gives you either it gives you new content that you hadn't thought of before, or it gives you a new way of looking at something so that you can bring new content out of your own brain to bear on the topic. So I think of it as ChatGPT is like the best brainstorming companion there is, because I'm not burdening it by asking it for its advice, but I could say something like, I'm studying this thing or I'm writing this chapter of a book. Give me 3 ways to begin that chapter that are all different, and then push it even further and say, okay, give me 3 more, but this time I want them written in a certain style. You don't want to plagiarize, but what it's doing is it's giving you essentially 6 opinions that are the sum product of whatever it scrapes online. And it's very valuable in that way as a brainstorming partner.
Are you encouraging use in your classes that you teach by any chance, or discouraging, or how are you looking at that, by the way?
It's funny. I'm about to start teaching an executive MBA class, and I had a series of assignments. The details varied from year to year, but I'd essentially been using some form of these assignments for about 15 years.
Yeah.
And I asked ChatGPT to complete them, and it did very well. It took me 30 seconds to get a B grade response. And probably with another 30 seconds, I would have got it to an A- or something like that. So I had to overhaul the entire course. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about ChatGPT. I'm sure it'll come up in some examples where we discuss it, but it is a very powerful agent if you're a student looking to bypass the barriers associated with an exam or an assignment. And so we professors have had to be obviously very careful about that. I'm sure you've experienced this too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm encouraging it, but just saying, give me transparency of how you used it. Specifically call it out.
Oh, that's interesting. That's smart.
But anyway, there's so many things I'd love to talk to you about, Adam, but how about I end with this? We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcasts, and your kids are still quite young, but can you think of some ways that you and your wife try to apply these ideas in your parenting?
Yeah, oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, I mean, I think this whole section on pausing, Lionel Messi might pause when he's playing soccer, but no one needs to pause more than an overwhelmed parent. There is no better thing to do in the moment than slow down before you respond. And I have been trying to do that a lot, especially as life gets busier in other areas. I don't want that to affect how I am with my kids. And so they behave the same way, but because I'm more stressed, I'm much more reactive. And I have tried very, very hard to embrace the sacred pause, embrace the messy pause. And there are a lot of other very successful people who pause in other areas as well. And I think for parenting, there is no better thing than taking that breath before you respond. You know, toning down the anger, taking the temperature down a little bit. That's been very useful for me.
Yeah, was it Inside Out? Was that the name of the Disney movie where
Yes,
like time to put the foot down?
yeah, that's right.
And it turns out to be just a disaster, right? And I can think of times where I've been in that mode too. And so I appreciate you sharing that, Adam. You know, for those
Yeah,
listening,
sure.
we all get stuck, and whether you're feeling that right now, you know what? You want to prepare for what's around the corner. And I strongly recommend you get a copy of Adam Alter's new book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Adam, thank you for joining us again on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy.